Thank you for joining us. Good evening, everybody. I'm Jonathan Creel, and I work for Los Alamos National Laboratory on the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. I'll be your moderator for this evening. So let me first say welcome to the annual Los Alamos Science Fest, and this is the virtual edition. This year's theme is 2020 Eyes on the Future, and there are many events this year. A huge shout out to all of the other partner organizations, and especially the Los Alamos Creative District, for adapting to this situation and putting together this great slate of virtual programming that we have going on. I've included a link in the chat, so if you scroll up to the top of the chat, you'll see a link to the full slate of programming that's coming up the rest of the week for ScienceFest 2020. That actually includes a pre-recorded talk from Dr. Tom Mason tomorrow night. He's the director of Los Alamos National Laboratory, and his talk is titled, appropriately enough, From Trinity to Today. And he'll discuss how Los Alamos National Laboratory continues to innovate and protect our nation today. And again, that is something that you can access from the link that I shared in the chat early on. And I believe that video will be available tomorrow beginning at 6:30. So tonight is brought to you by the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. This is a partnership between the Department of Energy and the National Park Service. The park was established in 2015, and we've worked together to protect, preserve, and interpret the Manhattan Project. And typically for the annual Science Fest, we host special tours on laboratory property of 3 of the Manhattan Project historic sites. But this year, given the current guidelines and restrictions, we had to cancel those tours. That also doesn't mean we're not still working to preserve those sites. The historic buildings team here has done a fantastic job and just finished preservation work on 2 sites, Concrete Bowl and Gun Site. And they're planning more projects for the near future, so keep your eye out for that. We'll put updates on the Bradbury Science Museum website when those happen, and on social media for the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. The Bradbury Science Museum has actually also gone online with some of their Manhattan Project artifacts and objects in the collection, so you can check those out from the comfort of your own home, just like tonight. I've included that link so you can check out some of the Manhattan Project stuff that we have here at the museum as well. So again, follow the Manhattan Project National Historical Park on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever social media you want. We'll have a lot of special content leading up to the 75th anniversary. There'll be some updates about the park as well. And again, just to reiterate, there's a couple of us managing this talk this evening. So bear with us tonight if we have any technical difficulties. I'll be running the slideshow and monitoring the Q&A. We'll stop monitoring the chat here at some point. And then if you do have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. Again, we should have over 500 people tonight that have registered, so we might not get to every question. We'll do our best to get to what we can. And this event will be recorded, and it will be on the ScienceFest website when this is over. So with that, I'll introduce our presenter. Clearly, he doesn't need much of an introduction for some, but instead of the tours this year, we do have this virtual talk, and it comes just in time for the 75th anniversary of Trinity. And we were fortunate enough to have Alan Carr, Program Manager and Senior Historian for Los Alamos National Laboratory. He began his tenure here as the Lanel Historian in 2003 and has produced several publications, given countless presentations pertaining to the Manhattan Project, nuclear testing history, and the historical evolution of Los Alamos National Laboratory. So if you've never had the pleasure of hearing him speak, you're in for a treat this evening. Thank you for joining us, Alan.
Hey, thank you, Jonathan. And it is great to see, well, everybody's name, I guess, down there at the bottom of the screen. Jonathan, I saw a couple of people commented that the links that you sent earlier were could only be seen by people who had signed in at that time. And so you might want to resend those again for everybody who's showing up now. But is everybody excited about Science Fest?
We have a woo.
Oh wait, that's the wrong one. Yeah. Excellent. I'm glad everybody's pumped. We're going to have fun. It's an interesting topic. I love seeing these guests. See, we need to have fun. I think the world deserves to have a little bit of fun. So despite kind of the heavy nature of our subject tonight, we're going to try and have a little bit of fun with this. So a couple of disclaimers, because those of you who've seen me speak before know that I have many disclaimers in my talks. This one, Trinity, it's a fun story. It's an incredible story. It's kind of got a dark side to it as well. We're going to talk about all those things. This is kind of a long talk, so I hope that everybody will bear with me tonight. But some things that we'll be missing. We're not going to talk a lot about the things leading up to Trinity. We're not going to talk about how the laboratory came into existence very much. We'll talk about it a little bit. Not going to talk about the greater context of the war all that much. Not going to talk about the end of the war very much, although I imagine some of you have some questions. It is, of course, the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And hopefully we'll have time, and I would encourage you to ask some questions there. But that's just not the focus of the talk tonight. This focus is on Trinity. And as we begin the talk, what I want to put out there for everybody to be thinking about, some of you probably have others with you, maybe watching this, is this. Do you think that Trinity was the greatest single scientific experiment ever conducted? It's a subjective question, but be thinking about that, because we'll, as we talk through it, and we'll get to the end, we'll talk about some conclusions, what this test meant. I think that we could make a strong case for it being the top, certainly one of the most important world-changing experiments of all time, but be thinking about that as we go through. Trinity really is a big deal. And so let's get right into it. Jonathan, if you could switch our slide. We are going to talk about the background a little bit, just really quickly. So fast do I have a bad echo? Is that everybody? Let's see. Hopefully I'm not echoing for everybody. Let me know. Let's see other comments if that's a problem on my end. Okay, so probably, okay, no echo. So that sounds like a local issue there, but we will try and monitor the comments. They're coming in pretty fast. But let's talk about what led up to Trinity, only going back to the formation of the Manhattan Project. So some of you know the story, of course, about Einstein sending in this letter to the president, to President Roosevelt, warning him about the discovery of fission and developments in Nazi Germany, where it was first produced. That's not really what started the Manhattan Project, and that's we can talk about that more if there's time in Q&A. But it took 3 more years to pass before the Manhattan Project finally came into existence for a variety of reasons. And so the Manhattan Project was formally established in August of 1942. Again, 3 years after the start of the war, 3 years after the Einstein letter was sent. It took a lot of things coming together to help people to realize that nuclear weapons were not just some far out technology, but that they were a transformative technology and that they were in reach. That's when the Manhattan Project was formed, to build these as quickly as possible. One thing that I want to think about as we talk about Trinity and all of the other topics that we'll be discussing tonight is this as well. Right now, there's a lot of bad things, a lot of unfortunate things going on in the world right now, and that was the case during World War II as well. A couple of things to keep in mind. I'm going to give you a few numbers to be thinking about that I think will help provide a little bit of context for why nuclear weapons were created in the first place, why they were used in combat, for that matter. The first one is this, the first thought. We see Adolf Hitler on the screen up there, and when you see Hitler, I'm sure that all of us, there's some pretty horrible images that come into all of our minds. I want everybody to stop and imagine Hitler having a nuclear monopoly. That was what people were scared of during much of when the Manhattan Project came into existence. And when you stop and think about what the world would look like if Nazi Germany, and only Nazi Germany, had nuclear weapons, the world could have been a much different place. That was what was going through their minds at the time. Okay. Another thing is that during World War II, the United States lost a little over 300 Americans killed in combat every single day on average. That number, of course, does not include casualties, people who were horribly injured during the war. And as scary as that number may sound, you know, we're starting to see some pretty scary numbers with COVID-19 right now. Other countries fared far worse than the United States. The Soviet Union, of course, the Soviet Union helped Hitler start the war in 1939. They invaded Poland 17 days later, after the German army invaded Poland. The Soviet Union, well, eventually, another important tip here, I would not advise making a deal with a Nazi. As many of you, you've heard my talks before, this is an important piece of advice. That came back to bite Hitler, or Stalin, I should say. Hitler decided to break the agreement that he started out the war with Stalin with and invaded the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union became an ally of convenience to Britain and then to the United States as well. The Soviet Union lost 15 to 20,000 people killed as a result of military action on average every day of World War II. Okay, and so that was what was going on in the world at the time. And I think, again, helps hopefully to provide a little bit of context for why the Manhattan Project came into existence and why we're going to get to Trinity momentarily. Many of you tuning into this story, you live in Los Alamos, you're at Los Alamos ScienceFest, so you know a lot about what happens next. J. Robert Oppenheimer, whose badge that you see up there, security badge, he becomes the director of the weapons design laboratory of the Manhattan Project. Another number here, it's been estimated that 500,000 Americans worked for the Manhattan Project at one point or another, and not just Americans, but we had other important contributions from foreign nationals as well. But over, approximately 500,000 people worked for the Manhattan Project at one point or another during its total existence. Here at Los Alamos, we didn't have anywhere near that many people. Most of those folks were employed elsewhere in the project. Many of them were construction workers, building places like Los Alamos, Hanford, Oak Ridge, etc., other sites as well. Our technical staff here peaked at about 1,700 people in 1945. So a relatively small part of the Manhattan Project, but an important part. And so the job for Los Alamos was to design, build, test, and help to figure out how to deliver nuclear weapons in combat. That was the function of the laboratory during the Manhattan Project. Oppenheimer, of course, is in charge of that. The first big crisis that they have is in the spring of 1944, when the laboratory is about 1 year old. And this starts to play into our story about Trinity tonight. So in the beginning, the main bomb of the Manhattan Project was called Thin Man. Not too many people have heard of Thin Man before because it didn't work. And so Thin Man was the plutonium gun design, okay? And so in a gun-assembled nuclear weapon, we're going to take a piece of subcritical fissile material, we're going to shoot it at another piece of subcritical fissile material to produce a nuclear explosive detonation. And Thin Man looked like a really desirable approach because a gun design is relatively simple from an engineering standpoint, and it uses plutonium. Plutonium's a energetic, very energetic metal. It's very efficient. The backup plan was called Little Boy, which everybody here, I imagine, has heard of before. Little Boy was the uranium gun. And so it too is a gun-assembled nuclear weapon, which we like from an engineering standpoint because it's relative simplicity, but it because it uses enriched uranium. Well, enriched uranium was really hard to make, and you're going to need an awful lot of it to have a nuclear weapon. So it's not as efficient. That's why it's the backup plan. So we get to that first crisis in the spring of 1944. Now, during the war at Los Alamos, we had 18 Nobel laureates here. Most of them would win their prizes long after the war was over. But one of them, one of the scientists who won a Nobel Prize later was Emilio Segre. He was from Italy, and he started performing experiments that made it look like plutonium might not work in this type of assembly after all. And the problem was pre-initiation. And so because of impurities in the plutonium, they would emit neutrons, you'd have a lot of neutrons in flux, and the bomb would not fully assemble before it went supercritical because of pre-initiation as a result of too many neutrons, if you will. So this is a big disaster, or it starts to look like it's going to be a big disaster because this didn't happen immediately. It took additional weeks and months of experimentation to fully realize that Thin Man was not going to work. The plutonium gun was not going to work. And so in the midsummer, in July, about this time in 1944, it became clear that plutonium would not work in that type of nuclear weapon. And so Oppenheimer reorganized the laboratory. He created multiple new divisions to look at a new way of assembling a nuclear weapon. And so this new way was known as implosion. So instead of shooting bits of plutonium at each other, we're going to have a plutonium sphere. We're going to surround the sphere with an awful lot of high explosives, embed detonators in the high explosives. And when the weapon goes into combat, the detonators will be fired simultaneously. They will ignite the high explosives, and they'll compress the plutonium ball at the middle to supercriticality, and we get a nuclear explosives detonation. Sounds pretty simple, right? Well, not exactly. And this was a problem. And before I come back to the problem, I want to kind of wrap up Little Boy, at least for tonight, because we're not going to talk about Little Boy that much more. It has been said that Little Boy went into combat untested. And that's not exactly true. So there was no full-scale test of Little Boy, but there were many smaller scale tests of Little Boy conducted here at the laboratory. Every component of Little Boy was rigorously tested, and criticality experiments were performed with the material that proved, that demonstrated clearly that that weapon would work in combat. So again, no full-scale test was necessary, but they knew Little Boy was going to work when it went into combat because of a result of small-scale testing. And so anyway, that is kind of Little Boy for tonight. So we're going to put it over there, focus back on implosion. And let's go back to our problems. So why is implosion more complicated? Well, first of all, high explosives. The high explosives that they used at the time were not, they were not sophisticated, exotic, ultra-safe materials. Los Alamos is really one of the birthplaces of the science of high explosives. And in the war, in the years after the war, we developed, our people here developed a lot of very good explosives compounds. Back during the war, because time was so critical, they had to use things that were available on the shelf. And so that's exactly what they did. They took explosives that were available, and this is where things get even trickier. We're going to have to take these off-the-shelf explosives, and we're going to have to make them do essentially the exact opposite thing that they're designed to do. And so with high explosives, explosives are supposed to expand, releasing energy outward, hence the name explosives. They are not supposed to implode on themselves. Otherwise, the name would be implosives, right? If you've heard this part of the talk before. And so think about the challenges involved. And remember, hundreds of Americans being killed every day, and Hitler could have a nuclear monopoly tomorrow. That was the type of pressure that they were working under. And so anyway, as we progress into the late summer and fall of 1944, many experiments, many high explosives experiments are done here at the laboratory to better understand what are called the hydrodynamics of implosion. How, can we actually simultaneously crush symmetrically a sphere of plutonium? Can we do that? This was very difficult, but with the testing, they gained greater confidence that this could actually be done properly. Now, let's see what we have on our next slide here. And we'll start digging into Trinity a little bit more. Very good. So we've talked about a lot of the stuff on this slide already, but as the scientists performed these small-scale, relatively small-scale, high explosives experiments at the laboratory, they started to understand the nature of explosives, started to understand how they could harness the energy to compress the plutonium, and they gained confidence, but not enough confidence to put it into combat without a full-scale test. And so why would you want to do a full-scale test? I mean, for instance, you can see the bullet down there at the bottom. It seems that General Groves, now General Leslie Groves was Oppenheimer's boss. He was in charge of the entire Manhattan Project, just wanted to put it into combat. Why do we need to test? And this is a very good question, because if you do a test, it's going to consume a huge percentage of the world supply of plutonium. We don't want to do a test unless it's absolutely necessary to do a test. But anyway, Oppenheimer persuaded him that a test should be done. And you see the reasoning behind it offered by the test director. And so Ken Bainbridge, who you see over there on your left, was the test director for Trinity. And he explains pretty clearly, we had to know if it's going to work before we drop it over enemy territory. We drop this over enemy territory and it does not produce a nuclear yield, then it's just going to splatter plutonium all over the place, which might be collected by the enemy, possibly used against us. Now we're going to talk about what happens in the event of a bomb not going off in a few more slides. But anyway, that's why we're going to do a test. We have to know if this new weapon is going to work. And again, as I mentioned before, Trinity may have been history's greatest single scientific experiment, but it was also the test of a combat weapon. And as we're going to see at the end of the talk, a weapon that went into combat, and many lives were lost as a result of its use. So again, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But let's go on to another slide for now. All right, so why that name? And what I did on this slide was I've compiled a bunch of stories that I've heard over the years. Many of these stories are related in a book by the late Frank Saz, known as The Day the Sun Rose Twice. Some of you in the audience may have known Frank. If you look up his book, his name was Ferenc, F-E-R-E-N-C, The Day the Sun Rose Twice. So some of those are collected in that book. But anyway, the reason that they came up with this name is pretty clear. Now, first of all, it was Oppenheimer who came up with the name himself. But he didn't have an exact recollection of that. And so years later, General Groves was writing his memoir of the Manhattan Project. And he got to the point of Trinity and wanted to know where the name came from. He didn't know, and so he wrote a letter to Oppenheimer and asked. Oppenheimer sent him a letter back, and I believe that some of this is recorded in a book that is edited by I think Alice Kimball Smith, and I can get you the link to that. We may have that at the end, we'll see. But anyway, Oppenheimer, he said he didn't have a clear recollection of where it came from, but at the time, but he did remember that he did name it. And at the time he had been reading John Donne's poetry, and as you'll see on the slide there, a quote from one of the poems that we think Oppenheimer may have been reading at the time was, "Batter my heart, three-personed God," a reference to the Holy Trinity in Christianity. And so we think that that is where the name came from. Definitely from Oppenheimer, and probably by his own recollection, probably through the inspiration of Donne's poetry. So let's go on to another slide. Going through these fast tonight, we might actually finish on time. Famous last words, right? So here's the question. At this point, we're going to get into the logistics of doing a nuclear test. And this is hard because how do you do a nuclear test? We're going to see step by step all of the issues involved in doing that. The first thing, and again, put yourself in their shoes. At that point in history, no one had ever done a nuclear test before. In 1943, well, I take that back. Nobody had done a full-scale nuclear test before. I was going to say nobody would even know if it would work, but actually they did know that it was possible because of Enrico Fermi's experiment at CP1, at the world's first reactor at the University of Chicago. Another contender for world's most significant scientific experiment. So anyway, where are we going to put this thing? They knew that a test would probably be required pretty early on. So planning started about a year before the Trinity test was actually conducted. Not quite a year, but pretty close. So Bainbridge is put in charge of this. He's also a group leader in the explosives, the newly formed explosives division at that point in time. He takes charge of this search, and they decide these are our requirements. First, it has to be flat, because when you set this off, you don't want the blast effects to be hitting surrounding mountains and things like that, which could alter the different measurements that you're trying to make of the blast. Next, the weather had to be favorable, and that's going to be very important primarily for safety purposes. And I know that some of you are interested in safety preparations, fallout, things of that nature. I will be talking about that a bit later in the talk tonight. So anyway, we need good weather for safety, and I'll explain why soon. Next, for security and safety, pretty obvious on this one, it has to be isolated, right? No explanation needed. And preferably, it would be close to Los Alamos. Why? Well, remember, one of the functions of Los Alamos is to build the weapons. And so we don't want trucking, we don't want to be trucking bombs, or at least bombs in components, very far from the laboratory. We want a pretty quick trip to get them from secure point A to secure point B. And so we want it to be pretty close to Los Alamos. Preferably, the land would be relatively easy to acquire. That was something that was true of most sites within the Manhattan Project, including Los Alamos. Many of you know that Los Alamos was the home to the ranch school, the Los Alamos Ranch School, a school for young boys. And also there were several homesteaders in the area as well. And so some evictions were necessary for Los Alamos, but low hundreds, not low thousands. And so again, we don't want to have to kick too many people off of their property to do this test. And then finally, by order, I believe, of the Secretary of the Interior, Native Americans could not be displaced to make room for this test. And so some of you are probably already thinking of potential sites for this. So let's look at the next slide and see some of the sites, at least, that were considered. All righty. And so here's a list. And as you can see, at least to some degree, all of the sites that you see on there, they did discuss. Some of these make more sense than others, given our requirements. But of course, first the Tularosa Valley here in New Mexico, that would have been relatively close to Los Alamos. Desert training area near Rice, California, a bit further away than we would like. We next have the La region near Grants here in New Mexico, another place relatively close. The Sandbar Islands, 10 miles off the coast of Texas, were also considered, but again, that's a long way from here. The closest place was southwest of Cuba and north of Thoreau here in New Mexico. That would have been, again, the closest place to Los Alamos. The Alamogordo bombing range. Now, I received a question in my email the other day. Why is Trinity associated with Alamogordo? You know, I see these books like, you know, Remembering Alamogordo or whatever, I forget the title of it. But why is it always Alamogordo? Because there are other towns closer to Trinity than Alamogordo. And I think that this is the reason why. I confirmed this with my friend Jim Eccles. By the way, Jim Eccles worked in the public affairs office at White Sands Missile Range for years and years. He's written a book called Trinity, available on Amazon, which I highly recommend. And we think that the name, or Alamogordo, is associated with Trinity just because the base was known as the Alamogordo bombing range back then. Closer towns would include Carrizozo, Bingham, which is a very, very small community. Of course, Socorro, San Antonio as well, all are much closer than Alamogordo. But anyway, what we see there, the Jornada del Muerto Valley, roughly translates to the journey of the dead man, or the journey of death. Okay, that sounds like a lovely place for a nuclear weapons test, right? And then finally, the San Luis Valley near Great Sand Dunes, and that's not far over the border into Colorado. Many of you have probably been there, been able to visit that. And yeah, that pretty much meets a lot of the requirements, but it's not exactly close to Los Alamos either. But neither is the Alamogordo bombing range. Remember, the roads were not as good back then. We're going to move a lot of the bomb material in a deuce and a half that's moving like 35 miles per hour. We have to drive through Santa Fe and Albuquerque or around, or just, you know, that's probably going to be our best option though. And that's why they ultimately decide to use it. And again, going back to our requirements, it's a military base. What better? I mean, it's already owned by the United States government. Some people, some ranchers, a couple of ranch families had to be evicted. They were leasing the land. They lived on the land. And ran cattle there. They were not very happy about that, I might add. But anyway, it's really going to be our best choice. And so that's why they selected in September of 1944, only weeks after Oppenheimer reorganized this laboratory. So let's see another slide. And I think, yes, here's another issue. Okay, so we've selected our site, but there's nothing there. And some of you may be thinking, well, you're doing a nuclear test. Isn't that good? But to do a nuclear test, there's going to have to be a lot more infrastructure there than people realize. As we're going to see later, there were a lot of experiments that were performed as part of the Trinity test. We're going to need people, we're going to need experimental facilities, we're going to need diagnostic, or we're going to need infrastructure to support diagnostic equipment, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what we see happen with Trinity Base Camp is kind of a microcosm of the Manhattan Project. We underplan, but then a lot of people come to the rescue and all is well. For instance, at Los Alamos, initially we thought that it would just be Oppenheimer as the director and, you know, maybe 100 scientists or something like that. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the technical staff jumps all the way up to 1,700. And that's what happened here at the test site as well. It grew. We quickly finished the base camp only to figure out that it wasn't going to be nearly significant enough to support all of the operations at Trinity. And so the camp was expanded in the spring of or the late winter, I should say, in spring of 1945. Now you see Howard Bush there, his badge photo up in the top right. Bush is in charge of the camp down at Trinity. He had about a dozen soldiers who were under his command at all times. In addition to the dozen soldiers, there were many laborers there, as you can see in the subsequent bullets. And again, these are real heroes of the Manhattan Project. There would not have been a Manhattan Project without all of the construction workers that built facilities all over the country. And so in this case, how would you like to be one of these folks? 200 laborers working 7 days a week for 30 days straight. They get a few days off, and then you get to come back and do it again. And pretty heroic effort to get all of this done. What were they building there? And you can see that on the next bullet as well. And we'll see some pictures of some of the different construction projects as we go through tonight. But they had to build dozens of miles of road, including a 25-mile road, just one, to move jumbo. And if you've not heard of jumbo before, we'll be talking about that a little bit later in the presentation. So we will come back to that and I'll explain it. But anyway, that was just one of many roads. That was the most significant single road. But also, they put up hundreds of poles for wires. And I imagine that many of you have been to the open house. There's an annual open house or two. I guess they're back to having two. Well, now with COVID-19, we don't know. But twice a year, typically, White Sands opens up the Trinity site for public tours. And those of you who have been here have probably seen some of these shortened telephone poles. Essentially, they look like miniature telephone poles. Some of them are still standing. Many of them have collapsed and followed over. But these were all wires from diagnostic measuring equipment to the weapon. And again, there's something that you can still see. Lots of those had to be put up, multiple bunkers. And so a couple of those bunkers are still standing. The smaller camera bunkers are still there. I believe the main camera bunker was the North 10,000 bunker, which is still there. I think that there was one at West 10,000, but the main bunker where all of the scientists, Oppenheimer and Fermi, where the test was operated from was the South 10,000 bunker. And unfortunately, it's gone. It was bulldozed many years ago. And so you can't see that anymore, sadly. But anyway, that's a lot of construction to be done really quickly to prepare the site for the test. And so let's go to our next slide. And thanks again to Jonathan for helping me out tonight. All right, so security precautions. Now this is an interesting one. How do you keep a nuclear weapons test secret? That's, proximity from people is one of the things that's going to help. That's why we want to find an isolated area, right? But you can't hide it from everybody. Not even on an Army base in South Central New Mexico. There's still going to be people who are going to probably see it. So how can we cut down on the number of people who actually see it? Some of you who are looking at the slides, of course, physical security was very important for this operation. The area was patrolled at the military base. But going back to, how do you keep it safe, or secret, I should say, from the public? Well, a couple of press releases were prepared. Now, our main security feature of this test is going to be to conduct it at 4 o'clock in the morning. Now, I know some of you were probably up at 4 in the morning. I was not among you, but a few of you may have been, but not many. There are not too many people who are milling about and out going about their business at 4 in the morning. So we'll set off the bomb very early and not too many people will see it. And so that was the plan. And the plan was, if only a couple people see it, who cares? We'll ignore it. But what if enough people see it that we have to have an explanation for what went on? Because again, this is kind of the scientific culmination of history's biggest secret project. And so 2 press releases were prepared. The first press release simply said that there was an ammo dump that blew up at the Army base. Nobody was injured, go about your business. And we're going to see that one later because they did have to use that one. But again, we don't want to have to use one at all. We'll talk about why they had to use that one in the first place. Now, we're going to talk about safety. We're going to start to talk about safety in a moment. The scientists realized, as we'll talk about briefly shortly, that there could be some hazards associated with setting off a nuclear bomb. And that if this weapon threatened people in the local area, it might be necessary to evacuate a community or some farmers or whoever, right? How do you keep that secret? And you can see the document that I've scanned there, which explains it. In the second press release, it would be said that a ammo dump at the base, which contained gas shells, poison gas shells, blew up, and therefore to protect the community of you, fill in the blank, had to be evacuated. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that they would have been evacuated to Kirtland Air Force Base, where they were prepared to accept some refugees. An evacuation, though, was not called, and we'll talk about that decision a little bit in a little bit, I should say. Let's go on to the next slide and keep things moving along. and we get to safety. And again, I know that this is something that is of interest to many of you. It is timely. We're going to talk about fallout specifically after the test is over later. So I'm not going to go into that quite a bit yet. And those of you who are expecting comprehensive, clear, scientific-based answers to all of your fallout questions, this is not, I'm not going to have them, but I will try and explain kind of what's going on right now and my interest in that topic in just a bit. So don't leave the talk quite yet. I hope that will be worth the discussion. So how do we keep people safe from this nuclear weapon going off? Well, we're going to have some pretty basic, but generally successful measures for that. And I say general because there are going to be some problems with Trinity, no doubt about it, which we'll talk about later. But anyway, especially early on, the scientists didn't think generally that this would be as big a problem as it turned out to be. And we'll talk about the countermeasures for that momentarily. But anyway, safety during World War II was a concern. It was a concern for our staff, the people that worked at Los Alamos. It was concern for our neighbors as well. But it wasn't necessarily the top priority. We'll talk about what the top priority was in a little while. There was something that was even more important than security during World War II as part of the Trinity test. But anyway, safety was something that they thought about. It was something that they planned for. And early on, they just didn't think that it would be that significant until they did the practice test. So the practice test for Trinity was called the 100-ton test. We have a slide on that coming up, and I will explain that. But they did this rehearsal test, and it revealed that fallout was going to be a much bigger problem than they thought, to the point where an evacuation of a community might be necessary. And so in response to that, there was an evacuation team that was comprised of soldiers. You can see that on the screen. There were 144 soldiers, and there were some, I think, I forgot if that included the officers or not. But anyway, they had quite a few soldiers who were ready to spring into action to evacuate communities had it been necessary. In fact, the last surviving Trinity witness that I knew well was Roger Rasmussen. And I've seen some of the names on the screen of those of you who are attending. Roger was a friend of mine, and I know that he was a friend of yours as well. He was a member of the evacuation detachment, ended up staying on at Los Alamos for many, many years after. So Roger was there and witnessed the test, but he was not called to action. No evacuation, again, was necessary for reasons we'll talk about later. But anyway, how would you know whether to evacuate a community or not? Well, we had technicians all over the state who had measuring equipment who could tell if radiation levels reached a certain point. We'll talk about the certain point that they had prescribed again after the test when we talk about fallout. But that's how it works. In short, we have radiation monitors around the state. Radiation reaches a certain level in a certain area. The evacuation detachment is called in. They get people to safety, and all is well. And again, that's not exactly what happened. Now, the weather, let's go back to the weather and why it's important, because it's like our main safety precaution. We want to do a test in a place that's arid, that's very dry, because, well, it's kind of nice to work in a nice dry area. But on top of that, if you set off an atomic bomb in the middle of a thunderstorm, what happens is all of this radiation is released, and radioactive particles, the radiation attaches itself to particles, which could be almost anything, right? It could be sand, it could be the remnants of the tower, other things like that. We want those irradiated particles to go way up into the atmosphere and to be spread all over the globe very gradually at levels that pose no threat to anyone. That is our hope. Now, if we set off an atomic bomb in the middle of a rainstorm, we're going to have a lot of humidity. We're going to have a lot of rain pulling a lot of material right back down over a concentrated area quickly. That's going to be a very bad day. And so we need a place where it doesn't rain. Okay, remember that one as well, because we'll talk about it a bit later. But anyway, you can see a couple of quotes about that people were thinking at the time. Now, the first one you see from Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer writes to his boss, General Groves, just a couple of weeks, a little bit more, about 3 weeks before the test. And he says, "It is my opinion that no personnel outside of the area controlled by us will in fact be measurably exposed." And I found no evidence in the National Security Research Center, which is where we maintain our records at the laboratory, to make me think that, I think that is exactly how Oppenheimer and the others felt at that point in time. Now, on the other hand, though, you see Louis Himpelman. Hempelman there, and you see his badge photo, he was the town doctor. And remember, health physics is in its infancy at this point in time. This is something that was still being learned about. And again, I'll come back to that when we talk about fallout in a little bit. But anyway, his quote is, all I could think of was, my God, all that radioactivity up there has got to come down somewhere. That quote was made many, many years after the fact, and I certainly don't doubt Dr. Hempelman at all, but I do think that Oppenheimer, I think that most people at the time leading up to Trinity felt that the test was going to be conducted in a safe manner. Again, we'll come back to that later. Let's go to another slide now. Okay, good. I thought I'd put Jonathan to sleep, so good. Jumbo, we've mentioned Jumbo a couple of times here. Now, early on, remember, there's not a whole lot of confidence that this new imploding bomb is actually going to work. What if it doesn't? What if we set off this bomb that has a lot of high explosive in it, but it doesn't go nuclear? It's just going to splatter plutonium all over the place, and plutonium is kind of like one of the world's most scarce and valuable substances. How do we get it back to try again? And they had a few different ideas for doing that. None of them were good. And I'm not criticizing the people who were thinking up ideas so much to say that that's kind of a hard problem to quickly recover a bunch of plutonium that you splattered all over the place. Perhaps the best of these, ideas was Jumbo, and it was a containment vessel, which you can see up there on the screen. So the idea was, and again, early on, and I should mention, Jumbo was, as you can see there, 214-ton containment vessel. Now that is not an off-the-shelf thing that you can buy at Lowe's or Home Depot. So it was specially fabricated by Babcock and Wilcox, I believe in Ohio. How do you get a 214-ton containment vessel from there to ground zero of Trinity? They had to send it all over the United States by rail because there was not really a route, a direct route that could support that kind of weight. And so they had to send it around the United States. It finally gets to Trinity, and then there's really not a good way to get it to ground zero, hence they had to pave the 25-mile road. They had to build a special trailer to put it on. And you can see the trailer underneath Jumbo there in the top photograph. I think that there were 48 tires on that trailer, and that too was custom built, I believe in Albuquerque, if I'm not mistaken. All this for Jumbo, and the way that it works is we're going to put the bomb inside of Jumbo, seal it, and then set it off. If the bomb produces full yield, it'll probably just completely vaporize Jumbo, and all will be well, money well spent, life goes on. If it does not produce enough yield, the containment vessel was designed to contain the energy released by the high explosives in Fat Man. And so the bomb goes off, does not produce a yield. Well, we open the containment vessel back up, and we send somebody inside with a scraper to scrape the plutonium off the walls, and then we can recast it and try again. By the way, I don't know if I would volunteer to be the Jumbo containment vessel mucker, but fortunately, in this case, it was not needed, and the bomb worked. Not to give away the end of the talk, sorry about that. But anyway, as we continue on, the workers built multiple towers as well. There were 3 towers at Trinity. One was for the 100-ton test, which may be our next slide. The second tower was for Jumbo, and the third tower was the main 100-foot steel tower for Trinity, which we'll talk about in more detail later. But anyway, a 75-foot tower was built for Jumbo. Jumbo was hoisted up on the 75-foot tower. They put it back down on the ground before detonation, though. And if you look at the bottom of the screen there, you will see Jumbo after detonation. I forget exactly how far away it was from ground zero. Not very, but even an atomic blast did not move it, hardly at all. For those of you keeping score at home, the gentleman in the left on the photo at the bottom is the famous Hungarian mathematician, John von Neumann. And somebody asked before we got started if these slides are available. They are. You can send me an email or send an email to Jonathan. I think we have those in the comment section. But I'll come back to that later. My address is abcarr@lanel.gov, and again, I will give that to you again in a bit. So let's keep moving on to the next slide. We'll talk about what happened to Jumbo later, although I kind of had some of the story. Or well, you know, Jonathan, actually, let's go back to that slide, because I think there is one more thing I want to address with Jumbo there, and that is the penultimate bullet there at the bottom, which I need to, I should probably change, because that's sounds definitive, and it's not. Jumbo, as you see there, it just kind of stayed around. Nothing happened to it. And after the war was over, not too long after the war was over, I think within a year or so, several 500-pound bombs were put inside of Jumbo, and it ripped the polar caps off. You'll see what Jumbo looks like now, because the center of it is still intact and at ground zero. But anyway, there was a story that General Groves was responsible for that he ordered the destruction of Jumbo. And I don't think there's any definitive evidence of that. And that's why I wanted to go back to that bullet. It makes it sound like, you know, well, good, I put supposedly in there. That's what it should be. But the story's not really well known. All we know is that they did indeed try to blow it up. They ruined it, and that really ticked off a lot of people back at Los Alamos, that they just, for no good reason that we know of, destroyed something that could have been used for scientific experiments. Now we can go on. So thank you, Jonathan. All right. What did we have on the next slide? There it is, Trinity experiments. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this because we don't have time. We've still got a lot of material to go through, and the talk's already half over, a little bit more. So anyway, what's the reason for doing this nuclear test? Well, the reason is pretty obvious. We have to know if it will work or not. That is the basic question that we have to answer, but it's not the only question that we want to answer. There were a lot of other questions that we wanted to answer, and a lot of other scientific phenomena that the scientists wanted to explore. Because think about this, nobody's ever done this before. There's never been an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction. What can we learn about how the universe works as a result of this test going off? And so what other things do we want to look at? Well, first of all, they wanted to assess the efficiency of the implosion. How much bang do we get for our buck being the fissile material in the bomb? Measure the energy release. And that goes back to, again, this is not just a scientific experiment, it's the test of a combat weapon. You're going to put this thing into combat. You probably want to know what this piece of ordnance is going to do when you drop it over a city or some other target. And so measuring the yield, measuring the energy release, measuring the blast, these are all very important things to know for a combat weapon. Recording earth shock. Now, there were different reasons for recording earth shock. My favorite story is that supposedly General Groves wanted to collect earth shock data for the post-war period. And the reason why, and actually if you look at the screen up there, the picture that has a 259 on it up there in the top left, that's a geophone that was buried to measure ground shock at Trinity. Apparently, Groves was worried that once it became public that the Manhattan Project existed and that it set off a nuclear bomb, he was worried that every homeowner, ranch owner within 1,000 miles would file a claim with the Manhattan Project, that their barn was falling down because of Trinity, that their cracked window pane, that their porch that was falling in was as a result of Trinity, and he wanted to have scientific data to prove that it was not his fault. And that was one of the reasons why they recorded earth shock data. Of course, they wanted to observe the behavior of the fireball and interpret radiological phenomena for obvious reasons as well. Now, it might not surprise you that a lot of these experiments failed. I mean, they were trying to figure out this stuff on the fly. These had never been done before, but a lot of them worked. A lot of the more crude experiments, I should say, for measuring blast worked. One of my favorites was conducted by Sir William Penny. And so here in the United States, at least, for those of us who know British weapons history, Penny is kind of the Oppenheimer of the United Kingdom. He was an important scientist here at Los Alamos as well. He was a blast wave phenomena expert. And so Penny got a board, a piece of wood. He got a piece of wood and he drilled holes in it. And the holes got smaller and smaller and smaller. And he covered the holes with a piece of tissue paper. And so when the blast wave of the Trinity test traveled through, it punctured the tissue paper of the larger holes down to a point, and he was able to roughly calculate blast based on that. And we're going to see some other examples of experiments like that were pretty successful as well. But anyway, the results of these experiments are compiled in many Los Alamos reports. I believe that if you visit our research library online, you'll be able to find many of the publicly releasable reports there. And so go check them out. Let's go on to another slide. Everybody still having fun? Hopefully. Well, most of you are sticking around, and I appreciate that. All right, yes, good. All right, so let's talk about the rehearsal test, because, you know, if you're going to set off a nuclear bomb for the first time ever, maybe, in the immortal words of Allen Iverson, maybe we should practice. Let's get some practice in. Or actually, I guess he didn't want to practice. We do want to practice in this case, though. And so what they do is they get approximately 100 tons of TNT, which sounds like a lot. And it was, in fact, a lot. I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, this was not even close to the largest blast ever up to that point in time, but I do believe it was the largest measured blast. It was the last time that that amount of explosive was set off as basically a scientific experiment, in this case, a calibration experiment for the full-scale Trinity test. So you can see, and my friend Pete Carr, Pete Carr, who has a Livermore badge, has won an Academy Award for developing film preservation techniques. He's one of our consultants at Los Alamos because we have a huge film collection. Pete has put together a film called Trinity and Beyond with some great footage in it. I highly recommend it. But there is some footage of the workers assembling the high explosives for this test. And you can see pictures, at least still pictures of them there on top. What they would do is they would put these big packages of high explosives, they were wooden boxes of high explosives together, and then they would use rubber mallets to hammer those things into place. Again, another Manhattan Project job you might not want. But I guess I call this picture on the right the survival class photo, because after everything was stacked and ready to go, they took a picture of all the workers who did such a great job getting this test ready. Now, the other thing was, because again, we don't think at this point that radioactivity is and fallout is going to be a big problem, but we better make sure. And so what they did was they laced this pile of high explosives with radioactive materials that they could trace with the monitors. Okay, and so this is all scaled down from what they think Trinity will be, roughly. So we want to know more about fallout. We also want to make sure that all of our diagnostic instruments are calibrated properly. And so they set this thing off on May 7th, 1945. And Jonathan, if you could play the video for us there. And I thank Pete for providing this with us. It's only a 7-second clip and it is silent. We'll see if it works tonight. There it goes. Hopefully you saw it. It was quick. We do have a couple of other videos, and when we send you the slides, you'll get to see this in explode in real time. But that is the 100-ton test. And for those of you who are familiar with the history of field testing, it will come as no surprise that stuff didn't work, and there were surprises. That's kind of the history of nuclear field testing. So first of all, the diagnostic equipment was off. A lot of it was off by a quarter second. And if you miss the first quarter second of a nuclear detonation, you miss out on most of the action. Sorry. And so that was a big error, which they were able to successfully correct for Trinity. And you'll see the fruits of those corrections in a few more slides. The other thing is that when they started tracing the radioactive materials that they had put in the explosives, when they did their calculations, they figured out that fallout was going to be a much bigger problem than they had initially thought, hence the creation of the evacuation detachment, the 144 soldiers, including our friend Roger Rasmussen. That's when they came into existence. Now, this date, May 7th, before we go to our next slide, is important for a couple of reasons. All of you already know that the anniversary of Trinity is a week from today. July 16th, 1945 was when it was done. We're already to May, and we're just figuring out that fallout could be a problem. We're just figuring out that the diagnostic equipment is off. We got to get this fixed fast. And so that's the first significant thing about that date. The second significant thing about that date is May 7th. Some of you who are World War II buffs, you've probably seen film from the end of World War II, in Europe at least, where the Germans are signing the surrender agreement. The Germans are going to quit fighting. It's over. I believe that it was Field Marshals Keitel and Jodl. You've seen it before. Guess what day that they were signing those agreements on? May 7th. Fighting stopped in Europe on May 8th. Now, why are we building these things in the first place? Well, we're in a race with Hitler to build an atomic bomb. Yes. Well, Hitler shot himself a little over a week before the 100-ton test was conducted. That's a part of our story as well. So with Germany out of the picture, the war's over. We're going to win. It's obvious Japan's not going to win the war if they ever had a chance, which I don't think that they did. But Japan kept on fighting. And again, we're not going to talk in depth about the end of World War II, but I do invite you to ask me questions. Hopefully we'll have plenty of time for Q&A, and you can email me questions as well, and I will send you a response. But anyway, as we continue on, World War II continues to rage, not in Europe anymore, but in the Pacific as well. So that's what's going on at this point in time. And I think when we do briefly talk about the war, at least, remember the date, May 8th. So the 100-ton test is May 7th. The next day, fighting stops in Europe. May 8th, because we're going to talk about what happens exactly 3 months later. And that's going to be important to closing our story out. Let's continue on. Okay, good. Jonathan's still with us. Rock. Everybody, thank you, Jonathan, for helping us out. Okay, now, we're a couple of days before the Trinity test now, and I don't know if my really good friend, Carrie Skidmore, is with us tonight. Many of you probably know Carrie. He worked at the laboratory for years. He is now retired, and I wish him well. Carrie has brought to light this part of the story, which was largely kind of lost over time, not completely, but people generally didn't talk about it. And this is, if you will, the second rehearsal test, known as the Kreutz or Pajarito test. It was conducted July 14th. Now, I live in White Rock, and many of you probably live in White Rock and commute up Pajarito Road every day, and you will pass by TA-18. TA-18 is where this test was conducted. And so the idea here is we're going to take a fat man, basically. Yeah, Valerie, love it down here in White Rock. We're going to take a fat man and blow it up at TA-18. Sound like a good idea? Minus the plutonium. And so this is a full-scale fat man test, but they're not going to put plutonium in it so that we don't destroy this area. You can see a picture of the apparatus there on the left. And if you look carefully, I know it's kind of hard to see there on the screen, but there is a ball inside that apparatus, and that is the imploding type device, okay? And anyway, they set it off on the 14th, and the initial, and I should say Ed Kreutz, who is one of our physicists here, this is who the test is named after. He was in charge of it. This thing goes off, and the initial results make it look as if Trinity's not going to work. Now, again, I want everybody to put yourself in the shoes of the scientists at the time. It's July 12th, 13th, 14th. Is anybody getting nervous yet? I mean, Trinity is just a few days away. Who's sleeping well? Probably not too many people. And to cap it off, at the end of the day on the 14th, yeah, it looks like Trinity's not going to work after all. So this kind of was a very bad day. Now, the person in charge of the explosives, which is what we're trying to understand, which is what we're trying to verify at this point, is the X division, the original X division, which back then stood for explosives, the division leader, George Kistiakowsky. Now, the picture in the middle, Kistiakowsky is in the background there, watching the assembly being built up for the Kreutz test device. He's kind of the guy on the hot seat because his high explosives do not appear fast enough to make the bomb go critical or supercritical, produce a nuclear explosion. And so a couple of things happen to calm things down just a tad. First of all, another one of our Nobel laureates, another future Nobel laureate, Hans Bethe. He's our hero. He looks at the numbers again. He decides, you know, there are some variables that I don't think that we considered in the initial assessment of the data. I've looked at the numbers again, and I think we'll be okay. I'm sure everybody's fine now, right? But anyway, Bethe, the guy who figures out how stars works, he's pretty confident it's going to work after all. And to further win the confidence of his colleagues, George Kistiakowsky places a wager on Trinity. He bets that it's going to work. In fact, he makes a wager with the director of the laboratory, with Oppenheimer. He bets Oppenheimer a month of his salary versus Oppenheimer's $10 that Trinity's going to work, and Oppenheimer takes the bet, which I've always kind of found sad in a way, that the director would bet against Trinity. But fortunately, he lost. You already know that, right? But anyway, everybody's on edge even a little bit more now that we get to the Kreutz test. So let's continue on and see what happens next. Now, this is a pretty fundamental question, right? We've got all these firsts and all these things that have never been done before. How do you select a site for the test? How do you make sure it's secret? How do you make sure that it is safe? Well, how do you actually do it? How are we going to actually set the bomb off, for instance? Well, who can we get in charge to work the logistics of getting this thing built, set up, and exploded? Enter another Los Alamos hero, Norris Bradbury, who you see down there in the bottom right-hand side of the page. Now, Norris, at that point in time, was one of the group leaders in explosives, in the explosives division. He worked for Kistiakowsky. And, you know, today, let's say that we wanted to do a test. Doesn't have to be a full-scale nuclear test. I don't want to say that. People take it the wrong way. But any test. A lot of you listening, you work at the laboratory, you do tests all the time. If we're going to do any test whatsoever, what do we have to do? Paperwork, right? We have to do paperwork on that test because, again, we want to make sure that we don't hurt ourselves or anybody else. Safety is job number one. And I kind of like living in an era where safety is job number one. But remember, for reasons we talked about before, safety is kind of maybe job 3 or 4. For reasons that I think were understandable given the wartime situation back then. Bradbury also had to write a procedure for doing the world's first nuclear test. You know how long it was? 5 pages, 4.5, really. And you see the first page of it there in the background. These are all the steps that we're going to take day by day to make sure that this thing goes off. And so Bradbury writes up a 4.5-page document. This is how we're going to do our nuclear test. And you can see, if you can read the print on there, we're going to move this here. We're going to assemble this on that day. Think about all of the little nuanced problems that nobody had ever had to tackle before. And you can see a list of them. How do you photograph an atomic bomb? Now, first of all, you might be thinking, well, who cares? I mean, there's more at stake here than taking pictures of the bomb for historians down the road. And you would be right. And I should mention that Pete Carran has also written a book, also available on Amazon. And I say that because all these videos that Pete has cleaned up for us, he didn't charge us anything for it. So I do like to repay Pete for his kindness. But he has a book called How to Photograph an Atomic Bomb, which is very interesting. Why does it matter? Well, as a historian, it matters to me. I think that it's interesting. It helps me tell a story. And, you know, these are kind of cool pictures too. But pictures, good photographs of the early fireball are very important for getting a good measurement of the yield. And remember, we need to know what the yield of this thing is because we're going to put it into combat. We need to know what happens. We need to know the optimal method for putting this new weapon into combat. So how to photograph an atomic bomb was a pretty important question at the time. We will talk about Trinity photography briefly because we want to keep things moving along, right? Second, how do you move it? How do you move a bomb from Los Alamos to the test site? Well, as it turns out, we moved it in multiple pieces. The explosives assembly, the high explosives assembly was put together at V-Site. Some of you, well, probably many of you have heard of V-Site before. It's still standing. It's part of the National Historic Park here, plug for the Park Service at Los Alamos. And anyway, they shipped that down in a truck and they shipped the plutonium. They shipped the pit down in the back of a sedan. And that's how they did it. So how do we transport a gadget? How about in multiple pieces that cannot accidentally produce an atomic explosion? Sounds like a good idea to me. How do you put it together? Because, right, we're going to ship it in multiple pieces. How do we get it back together down at the site? How do you set it off? You know, are we going to get Wile E. Coyote and a plunger to set this thing off? And no, that was not the case with Trinity. I have seen some rockets launch that way. And if you don't believe me, I will send you the video. But how are we going to set this off? Here's a big question. What if it doesn't work? Who is going to call General Groves and tell him that it doesn't work? And by the way, if you get assigned that job, well, it's your lucky day. You're not even going to have to place a call because he's going to be there. That's right. General Groves will be there at base camp watching the test. That could be a big problem. And that's going to become a big political problem as well, because I know this is going to shock you, but safety and security, not the top priority of Trinity. Politics was. And I'll explain why briefly. But anyway, going back to Bradbury, Bradbury is really interesting, kind of unsung, self-effacing hero in all of this. Of course, he became the director of Los Alamos after Oppenheimer left, and he was our director for about 25 years. Hence, the museum is, I would say appropriately, named after Norris Bradbury. So let's go on to our next slide, see what we have next. We need to get to some more explosions because we don't have all night, and I apologize for that. So we're going to run through cameras really quickly. We already talked about why that was important. There were about 50 official cameras that documented the test. The document that you see in the background there lists those cameras one by one, where they were, what speed they would be operating at, et cetera, et cetera. And there were different cameras to capture different types of data. And, you know, for some of you who are camera enthusiasts, I know that there are a lot of photographers here. You might look at that middle bullet there, Vastax cameras running at 10,000 frames per second, and you might not be impressed because you know that there are cameras that operate a whole lot faster than that today. Well, guess what? Back then, in 1945, you couldn't just go to Amazon and buy a camera that would do that and a lot better. They were using purely mechanical cameras to achieve that frame rate, which I think is remarkable. And that was just one of many side projects that came as a result of the Manhattan Project. And of course, they wanted to measure gamma rays and light wavelengths and different things like that. And so there were different types of cameras to do that as well. Additionally, observers were given handheld cameras just to go and take pictures. Sorry, my COVID-19 hairdo keeps falling in my face there. I apologize for that. But anyway, there were people who had kind of handheld cameras who would record the test as well. And I think that the most famous picture of the Trinity test that was taken, and the only colored photograph of the Trinity test that was taken by one of those observers with a handheld camera, a photographer named Jack Abbey, and hopefully many of you have heard of Jack's name before. We're going to see his image coming up, I think, pretty quickly now. Let's go to another slide. Okay, now remember, one of our problems was putting this thing back together. We're going to get to that in just a moment, but let's go back to politics first. Some of you might be thinking, well, of course, politics trumps everything, doesn't it? Yes, it does, and that was certainly the case at Trinity as well. We have to set the bomb off on July 16th, regardless of what happens, even if the weather's not perfect. We got to set it off on July 16th. Why? Well, because the Potsdam Conference started the next day. At the Potsdam Conference, President Truman, we have a new president now, President Truman meets with Stalin and Winston Churchill, basically to carve up Europe and to look ahead to the end of the war in the Pacific. Pretty significant meeting. Of course, Potsdam is a city in Germany where they met. We need to send the president into a meeting with Joseph Stalin, knowing whether he has an atomic bomb available in his pocket or not. And so that's where the politics comes in. We've got to let the president know from day one what he's got available to him as he goes to the negotiating table with arguably history's greatest mass murderer, Joseph Stalin. And again, I know that there are other candidates you can debate amongst yourselves, but anyway, Stalin, bad guy. Hopefully we all agree on that. Going back to assembly, we're going to put it together on Friday the 13th. Lovely, right? And Kistiakowsky thought that day would bring them luck. And as it turns out, it kind of did. At first, when they tried to put the pit with the high explosive, it didn't fit. Now, this was a momentary crisis. I even hesitate to use the word crisis because the scientists there knew essentially immediately what was going on. What had happened was you had the high explosives assembly, which was sitting in this improvised tent structure at the base of the 100-foot steel tower. And we'll come back, we'll close out this slide by talking about why they set this off on top of the tower in just a moment. But they put up a tent at the bottom of the tower where they put it together. So the HE is sitting in the shade. Meanwhile, the pit has been sitting in the back of the sedan again, getting hotter and hotter and hotter in mid-July in south central New Mexico. So what's going on with the gadget due to the heat? We have a little bit of thermal expansion. And so when they tried to put it with the high explosives, it didn't fit. They realized that thermal expansion was the problem. And so they put it in the shade where it cooled off. They waited a little while and everything fit together perfectly. So it's all good. They complete the installation. And by the way, the middle picture that you see there, that is of course Oppenheimer on the left. I believe that my dog needs to go outside, but we'll see what happens. We'll try and go fast. But anyway, that is Oppenheimer. I believe that for those of you who know a little bit about criticality history at the laboratory, I believe that the other person that you see there is Louis Slotin, who would die in a criticality accident less than a year later. But anyway, Norris Bradbury was primarily in charge of assembling the gadget, the non-nuclear components of the gadget. So jumping back to this, why did we put the bomb on top of a 100-foot steel tower? Why not just set it off on the bottom or on the ground? That would be a lot easier, right? Well, yeah, really. Thank you, Deb. Another pro tip there tonight: get a doggy door. that would be good. Our dog's still so small that it can actually get through the fence and get out, and so I would just let it out there and leave it. But I can't do that right now. But she'll be okay. And we actually have toilet paper. Yeah, nice to have that back in the stock, right? But let's go back to our 100-foot steel tower. The tower that they used was actually half of a Blau and Knox 200-foot radar tower. So again, this is a product that was not custom built. It was something that they could pull off the shelf and that they were able to use. Now, why 100 feet? Well, they thought for a couple of reasons. Well, there's two reasons. One of them you see the bullet for there. If you set a bomb off on the ground, it immediately just kicks up dirt and you don't get good pictures. And we already talked about why you need good pictures and film of the test, right? So that's problem one. So we need to get that bomb up there so that we can see the fireball expanding before it's covered in dirt. The other thing is that they thought that that would cut down on fallout. Because again, when the bomb goes off and all that radiation is released and it fuses with other particles and irradiates them and shoots it up into the atmosphere, well, we want to really limit the amount of material. So what is sitting around that it could come in contact with? Well, a lot of earth. There's a lot of sand that it could fuse with. If we can get the fireball away from the sand, then we'll probably have less fallout. The issue here is that this was a big miscalculation. The bomb, and they thought that it could be a miscalculation. They even put pavement. They put asphalt down around the bottom of the tower to help try and cut down on the amount of soil that was brought into the fireball, irradiated and ejected into the atmosphere. But anyway, you know, I better let the dog out. Hold on just a second. Talk amongst yourselves. Come on. Sorry about that. So I'm gonna watch her there. This should be a quick one because she was under duress. But anyway, this was another. Hey! I saw that, Valerie. So anyway, this didn't work. And so again, when we talk about fallout, we have a slide dedicated to fallout in a few minutes. Trinity, that test device was too close to the ground. It should have been a lot further away from the ground, but because it was close to the ground, it produced more fallout, and that's going to be a problem. So anyway, let's go on to our next slide. I'm going to check on the dog while it's loading. Okay, it's still going. Yeah. Hey, real life happens, right? My daughter usually takes care of the dog, but she is working at Papa Murphy's Pizza tonight. So everybody go get a pizza when you're done to enjoy watching the after this. So yeah, very good, very good. Please turn off that light. Okay, countdown. Now we're getting to the good part though, right? It's almost time to set this thing off to see what happens. And so now on July 15th, the arming party goes to prepare the device. And it is comprised of Ken Bainbridge, our test director, George Kisiakowski, the ex-division leader, and Joseph McKibben. And you see McKibben's card there. He's not related to Dorothy McKibben. I know that there will probably be a few questions about that. They don't spell their names the same way. They are not related in any way. Hey, she come back. Hold on. Sorry, really sorry. Okay, she's back. All right. Okay. And look at her. Look at her. Thank you for being patient. We thank you. Okay. Let's finish the story here. So Joseph McKibben, really quickly, this is a challenge for everybody who works at the laboratory, especially those of you who are group leaders. Group leader is a tough job at the laboratory, always has been. I think Joseph McKibben was the longest serving group leader in the history of the laboratory. I think he was a group leader for like 31 years. So if you can top that, let me know, because that's a lot of performance reviews to sign off on. But anyway, they're our arming party. As I mentioned before, the main bunker is going to be the 10,000-yard south station. That's where Oppenheimer is going to be, along with the arming party, other notable scientists, Kistiakowsky, and Sam Allison, whose picture that you see there. He's going to do the countdown for us, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. And so anyway, remember, we're going to set this thing off at 4 in the morning, and nobody's going to see it. And we won't have to issue a press release. And we're going to test down at the Alamogordo bombing range because it never rains there. Well, guess what happened that morning? Now, one thing, again, thanks to Jim Eccles and my another friend, James Konetka, he wrote The General and the Genius. He has a book coming out on Trinity, hopefully before long. I've been talking with them, and you can read and you see and I promoted this myth, I apologize. But you read in a lot of places in the secondary literature and see on television programs that a tremendous thunderstorm came through the area, delaying the test. Well, there's really not any evidence that there was a tremendous thunderstorm. The evidence is that there was some rain. Not much, but there was some rain. And it was enough rain to cause a delay. In fact, in a lot of the area, it was just a heavy mist. So sorry to build the drama with a big thunderstorm, but there's really not any evidence of that. So there was light rain in the area, and they delayed. Remember, we cannot set off a bomb in a rain of any kind. And it was delayed till 5:30. And it was debated, should we delay the test? But you already know the answer to that, don't you? Because what's the most important thing here? We have to let the president know if he has a bomb or not. So it's got to be done on the 16th. The other reason that it had to be done on the 16th is, remember, how much sleep have you had now? If you hadn't been sleeping well leading up to the Kreutz test, how much sleep did you get July 15th, July 16th? Probably not very much. Can you really take another 24 hours? And so they decided we will just delay it. The meteorologist at the time, his name was Jack Hubbard, he predicted, I believe, that that all the storm, the rain would dissipate with the sunrise. And so they rescheduled the test for 5:30. Now, a few of you may have been up at 4 this morning, but I bet a lot more of you were up at 5:30. And so that's going to be a problem. More people are going to see this test. But anyway, they decide to move forward because even security is secondary to letting the president know if he's got a bomb or not. So the 20-minute countdown begins at 5:09. And we're still trying to figure out exactly the point of detonation, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. We already talked about the Oppenheimer and Kistiakowsky bet, okay? So the director has bet against Trinity working. And if you look down there at the document, that is the document on the left. That is the last page of Norris Bradbury's 5-page procedure. And as you'll see, July 16th, 0400, bang. Well, we're going to have to go to revision B on that document. And by the way, that is Norris standing next to the gadget in that pretty famous photo that you see right above it. So is it going to work? Let's see. Next slide. I know you're all shocked. It worked. And so Allison counted, Allison's countdown went, I believe, 3, 2, 1, now. Now was the first word of the atomic age. And that time that I have up there at the top, 5:29 and 45 seconds, according to Bainbridge's report, and I want to thank my friend Madeline Whitaker, who's also she's an archivist and a historian here at the laboratory. According to Bainbridge in the test director's report, the time was actually 5:29 and about 15 seconds. So for those who are counting seconds, I did get a little bit wrong there, at least according to the test director, and we should probably trust him. But when this device went off, it produced a yield equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT. That 100 tons that we had a few slides back doesn't seem very impressive anymore, does it? When this bomb goes off, it instantaneously reaches temperatures in the millions and millions of degrees. The mushroom cloud, the famous iconic mushroom cloud, by the way, the picture that you see there is Jack Abbey's famous color photograph of the test, 1,000 meters wide before it rose in a column of smoke, and that traveled high up into the atmosphere, over 40,000 feet in about 5 minutes. Oppenheimer was at the 10,000-yard south bunker. General Groves was a bit further away at the base camp, which I think was, well, there it is, 17,000 yards. But it took 40 seconds for the shock wave to reach base camp. Now, for those of you who are kind of new to atomic bombs and what happens when they go off and this and that, if you watch documentaries on TV, a bomb goes off and what happens? You hear a bunch of crackling noise of the explosion and maybe some opera music, right? That's kind of it. In actuality, that's not what you hear. There's no opera music. At Trinity, there was silence. And that's because the speed of light is so much faster than the speed of sound. And so when the bomb goes off, you see this tremendous flash of light, and it's perfectly silent. And not just for a couple of seconds, but for the better part of a minute. The scientists, the observers, there were probably between 200 and 400 people present for Trinity officially. Imagine what that must have been like as they looked on. And actually, I have some quotes that will give you a little bit of insight into that in the next slide. But anyway, once the shock wave reaches, it's kind of like if I got a leaf blower and turned it on high and put it right in your face as somebody shot a rifle right next to your ear. That's kind of what it's like when the shock wave hits. So it is dramatic. Now, because enough people saw this bomb go off at 5:30, the Manhattan Project was forced to release press release number 1. And you can see a copy, and I'm sorry that the quality of the scan is poor there, but you can see a copy of the press release down there at the bottom of the page under Jack's photograph. So again, large ammo dump blew up, pyrotechnic display, nobody was hurt, go about your business. And that's kind of what happened. Let's go on to our next slide. These are really quickly what some of the pictures of Trinity looked like from different types of cameras. You see the Fastax cameras and the Mitchell cameras. These were cameras designed to capture the very early unfolding of the fireball. If you look there at the bottom of the page, that first picture taken by the Mitchell, that is a nice, smooth fireball, which you can get a precise measurement of and calculate yield. Right above it, the Aero cameras, these were big cameras that were designed to capture large panoramic views of things. In fact, in our film collection, we still have the original film from Trinity, and the Aero cameras produced, I believe it's 9-inch format film. I bet nobody has used one of those before, but anyway, each frame is 9 inches wide. And so it's about the size, it's not that much smaller than a piece of paper, each frame. From the Aero cameras there. Let's go on to our next slide. And I want to thank our friends again at Livermore for scanning those for us. They helped us. And this is another video. I think it's going to be kind of glitchy, but we'll go ahead and try and play it anyway. I'll let it play for a few seconds. Now, for those of you who would like to see this footage and more, I have a lot of that on my personal YouTube page. And so if you go online and search for Alan B. Carr, YouTube, I think that it will bring it up. I've got about 40 videos from the laboratory up there now. And again, this is my personal webpage. It's not affiliated with the laboratory, but there's quite a bit of footage from Trinity and other things from the nuclear era as well, if you would like to go and look. And they will probably play a little less glitchy for you when you go there. Yes, thank you, Jonathan. Let's go on to another slide. We've still got reactions and fallout and legacy to talk about. And I want to have some Q&A. So what did it look like? That's what we have on this slide. And I'm going to let you read those for yourself as you go through, with one exception. and that is Philip Morrison there. If you look at Philip Morrison's quote in the middle, a lot of these quotes predictably have to do with light. Oh, it was so bright, it was amazing, and this and that. But you know, Morrison was 10 miles away, and what got him was not the light, but the heat on his face from that massive blast. That gives you some idea of the intensity of this new weapon. And then, of course, there at the bottom, for those of you who are fans of the New York Times, like my friend Marie Harper, who is signed in with us tonight, the New York Times covered the Trinity Test. William Lawrence, a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, was sworn to secrecy because this was going to remain secret, but only until these weapons were put into combat. And as soon as they were put into combat, the United States wanted the whole world to know what they were and what had just happened. And so Lawrence had several stories that were ready to go. Over there on the right, really quickly, that is Enrico Fermi. Fermi was another one of the Nobel laureates here and a division leader. He was also one of the only 2 associate directors we had at the time. That picture was taken by my friend, and yours too, Harold Agnew. Harold, who was our 3rd director here at the laboratory, was one of Fermi's students, and he took that picture, which is my favorite picture of Fermi. Behind the picture, you will see Fermi's original typed up observations of the Trinity test. And in the 2nd paragraph, he describes an experiment he did to measure the yield of the test. He got pieces of paper, tore them into strips, and dropped them. So before the test, he dropped one, it went straight down. As the blast wave traveled through, he dropped additional pieces of paper, which were pushed, I believe it's 2.5 meters is what is in the document. So based on how far the shock wave pushed that piece of paper, Fermi calculated that the blast was about 10,000 kilotons, only off by a factor of 2 with a blank sheet of paper on the fly. Pretty impressive stuff. Let's go to our next slide. So what did it feel like to see this thing? And you've probably all seen quotes, and actually don't look at the quotes there quite yet. I'm trying to cover them up, but you can see them, can't you? Let's try and play this video over on the right. And if it's glitchy, Jonathan, we'll just stop it, but let's give it a shot to play. And turn your volume up, by the way, so you can hear it, because this is a bit more quiet.
Would not be the same. 2 people laughed. 2 people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all felt that one way or another.
Now, that's pretty dramatic stuff. Oppenheimer said that many years after Trinity, reflecting back on the test. Many of you probably heard that quote before, maybe in a documentary or something like that. It's often used and often misinterpreted. So if you looked at Oppenheimer's remarks there, Oppenheimer was not saying, he was not comparing himself to the Hindu god of war. Taking on his multi-armed form, I have become death. If you listen to the story carefully, he talks about how the multi-armed god of war is trying to persuade the prince to do his duty. Oppenheimer does not see himself as the god of war. He sees himself as the prince, reluctant to do his duty. Oppenheimer, as well as anybody in the world, knew what was going to happen when these weapons went off in combat. And he was not excited about that. Would you be, even given the circumstances of World War II? He was not thrilled about that. The use of atomic weapons, we'll talk about this a little bit more in a few moments. It was the best of several bad options, in my opinion. And there's a lot of area, it's a subjective question, right? But Oppenheimer, I think he recognized that and probably would agree. And you see that reflected in the heaviness of his tone. You see the responsibility that he bore for bringing this technology into the world. If you want to find out more about that quote, Alex Wellerstein, who's one of my favorite historians, he has a blog online, and he's written a full story on the background behind that quote. I would encourage you to take a look at it. What Oppenheimer said there is not necessarily reflective of how most people felt at the time, though. Look at Norris's quote there. Hey, we were at war. Americans were being killed every day. I was just glad it worked. That was how a lot of people felt. I think that Harold Agnew felt that way. My favorite quote here, though, is from Victor Weisskopf. If you look at Weisskopf's quote, that in very succinct fashion captures the range of emotions at Trinity. And that's what it was, a range. Of course they're excited. We're elated. They had been putting long days for years into this to make it a success. It was the grand scientific experiment, maybe ever, and it worked. It was the birth of a new era. They were excited. You would be too, right? Then we realized we hadn't slept in the past 48 or 80 hours. They were physically exhausted. And then finally, they were worried. What does he mean by that? Well, you had World War I, the Great War, the war that was so terrible that it was going to end all wars, and then it was repeated in World War II. The scientists were already thinking of the next war in which nuclear weapons would be used by the great powers against each other. Of course they were worried, and so that's what you see. The ride back to Los Alamos was apparently a very somber one. Now, Stan Ulam's quote that you see at the bottom of the page there, Stan chose not to go to Trinity. He stayed back here at Los Alamos. He was one of our mathematicians. Lots of good Stan Ulam stories. He's written a book, by the way, called Adventures of a Mathematician, which you might look up. You see his quote there. You could see it on their faces. I saw that something very grave and strong had happened to their whole outlook on the future. And so these are, again, the range of emotions that you see in the aftermath of Trinity. Let's go on to another slide. We'll start running through these really fast now. I apologize for that. But I think most of you who are sticking, well, all of you who've chosen to stick around and can stick around today, the physical aftermath of the test, you see some pictures of what ground zero looked like afterwards. When the bomb went off, it vaporized most of the tower. It shattered the remaining portion of the tower. It pushed the ground down. When it pushed the ground at the bottom of the tower down, it exposed the reinforced concrete footings of the tower. And if you look at the picture there, second from the left, that is Oppenheimer and Groves inspecting the rebar that had been inside the concrete footing of the tower, which had been just under the surface of the ground. And so that gives you some idea of the force that was felt. Again, we kind of miscalculated the expansion of the the fireball and the force there. But anyway, because we're in a hurry, look at the picture there on the right. If you look in the bottom right-hand corner at about 5 o'clock, you will see a little black dot. That little black dot is where they did the 100-ton test. 100 tons of TNT made that little black dot. Well, we just take a few kilograms of plutonium and look at what it's done. You see ground zero there. Well, why is the ground dark like that? What happened was as the fireball expanded, it scooped up the desert soil and melted it. And so that molten sand in the fireball rained back down to earth. When it got back to the ground, it gradually re-solidified into a greenish glass-like substance, and that is now called trinitite. And so the next time that you visit the Bradbury Science Museum, I believe that you can see a very nice display. I think it's still on display there pertaining to trinitite. Take a moment, not just to look at it, but to consider that that had been in the fireball of the world's first nuclear test. Let's go on to our next slide. All right, and now we'll talk about fallout a little bit. And this is where, first of all, I want to emphasize, I'm a historian. I'm a trained historian, and I'm not a health physicist. Some of you may have questions about fallout because, as I imagine everybody here knows, this remains an ongoing issue in New Mexico. There is a downwinders group, and I would encourage you to look it up to learn more about this, to look at the news stories, because this is a story that is still with us today. And again, as a historian, I can't answer your health physics questions, but I do have an interest in this, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. But anyway, this blast did produce a lot of fallout. You put that much plutonium in a bomb that close to the ground, there's going to be a lot of stuff to be irradiated and shot up into the atmosphere where it's going to fall somewhere. And quite a bit of it fell. You can see the plume that was calculated that in the map that I have there on the right, and you can see the reading levels because, again, we had people all over the state. There were not evacuations for a couple of reasons. I think first that there were some assumptions that were made that the instruments were were off, when in fact they may not have been. The readings were as high as they were actually reading. Not sure about that. But the other thing was where they set the upper dose limit. And so going back to what was known at the time, scientists realized that this was hazardous material. The issue was when you're looking particularly at long-term effects and things like that, there was almost no body of work that existed at that point in time. About the only information on long-term effects as a result of exposure to harmful materials, radiation, were produced as a result of the radium dial watch workers. So you may remember some of the, I think that they were known as the radium girls. These young ladies would paint the dials of clocks with radium paint. They would put radium on there, lick the brush to get a nice fine point. That's really turns out to be a very unhealthy thing to do. Many of these young ladies became sick as a result. But even though this was done in the late teens and the early 20s, it wasn't litigated until the mid-1930s. And so you really didn't have a big body of evidence pertaining to, well, what does radiation do to the human body over a large amount of time? So the scientists had to make good faith guesses, basically. And so at that point in time, Hempelman and Stafford Warren was the doctor of the entire Manhattan Project. They set the upper dose limit over a 2-week period at 75 Roentgens. Okay, now to put that in perspective to today, that is roughly equivalent to what me or other DOE workers can be exposed to over the course of an entire lifetime. And so the things have changed over time because we have more data, but that's where they decided to set it. Again, that was one of the factors in the decision not to evacuate areas. And again, you can look at the map and you can see kind of where the plume raised and what the levels were. There was a family that was heavily irradiated. The government really tried to track down every person in the area, and they missed a family. And anyway, Frank Kazaz, in his book, The Day the Sun Rose Twice, he has more information on that family and what happened to them in the years that came. So there weren't too many people in the immediate area of danger, but there were cattle in the area. There were a lot of cattle in the area. And the issue is, you know, if you're a person, you might be inside, or even if you're outside, you might go take a shower or get cleaned up. Cattle don't do that. They just kind of stay out all the time. And what would happen is these irradiated particles would drip back to Earth, get into their fur, and just stay there. And it actually caused pretty significant burns. It blotched their coat. And so obvious was the damage done to the cattle that well, not the DOE back then, but the Manhattan Project, of course, the Manhattan Project had to buy 75 of the most injured animals, and they sent them to Los Alamos. I guess there was nowhere better to send them, where they were studied for a brief time, but then sent to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where the herd, and you actually see that is the Trinity herd there in Tennessee, where they reproduced generation after generation and were studied. So again, that's kind of some of the data to give you a flavor for the fallout problem. There is a study called the La Hadra study. It's called the Los Alamos Historical Dose Reconstruction Project. I'm missing a couple of letters there, but I would encourage you to look at the LAHDRA report online. There is a chapter on Trinity. And as I mentioned before, this is something that I'm interested in. One of the authors of the La Hadra report, his name is Joe Shanka. He's a friend of mine. I don't think he would mind me mentioning his name. He recently gave a talk on this subject here in New Mexico, and he continues to study this. And I have been staying in close contact with Joe, and as a historian, am very much looking forward to learning more about the issue of fallout. But again, I'm not a health physicist, and so I can't give you just definite answers on this, and I don't think that they exist yet, but I know that Joe is very interested in pursuing this even still today. So again, an active issue here in New Mexico and other places as well. Let's continue on and try and close things. Man, I went overtime, but a lot of you stuck around, so I assume everybody's still having fun, I hope. Not so much fun is ending the deadliest war in the history of mankind. World War II claimed between 60 and 80 million lives. You may have some questions that you can either ask me after the talk here in a minute or two, or maybe 5, or email me as well. I don't mind questions about the end of the war. This kind of stuff needs to be talked about, and certainly needs to be remembered. It is, again, the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings as well. The Japanese continued to fight on for several reasons. We can talk about those if you want, but we don't have time right now. And so it was chosen to use nuclear weapons in combat. I think that the basic reason why that decision was made, and I don't think it was really a decision, to tell you the truth, Bart Bernstein, who's a historian, I think it was him who said, it wasn't so much a decision, so much as it was the implementation of an assumption. What you're trying to do is inflict the maximum amount of damage on Japan as possible, and to put as few of your people, Americans, Brits, allies, in harm's way as possible. Well, what better way than an atomic weapon? There's no countermeasure for an atomic weapon. There are countermeasures for 500 plane bombing raids. If you send 500 planes to Tokyo or other cities in Japan, you're putting thousands of Americans in harm's way to do that, many of whom are going to lose their lives or be captured. With an atomic bomb, one plane out of nowhere, there's nothing you can do. There's no fighting back. And I think that was an important psychological reason for the Japanese that helped them bring the war to an end. They could use the excuse that they had been defeated by technology instead of an adversary who had greater will to fight or whatever. Again, we can talk more about those at the end. But a lot of this, many of you may have very different opinions on this, and it's subjective history, for the most part. But anyway, Little Boy, which is our uranium gun weapon, was used against the city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. 64,500 people died by the end of the year, and I should have added that on there, but that should say by mid-November 1945. And my numbers that I have in here come from the 1954 Army Pathological Study. So it is a scientific study. I don't think there was a lot of politics involved. It is reliable, and enough time had passed where they could collect a lot of data, and I think that it was probably assessed properly there. But again, I hate to make this sound so clinical, just talking about numbers. It's impossible to quantify that kind of loss of life. This was a great shock. Moving on August 8th, remember when I told you to remember the date, May 8th? We had wanted Stalin to enter the war in the Pacific on our side to help us destroy Imperial Japan. Why would we want Stalin out there? To end the war. What better a tool to use than the Red Army to help end the war? So Stalin agreed at the Yalta Conference in the spring of 1945. He said, 3 months after the collapse of Nazi Germany, I will help you in the Pacific. And true to his word, and to that day, on August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. And early the next morning, on August 9th, the Red Army invaded Manchuria and killed about 84,000 Japanese soldiers in the short campaign that ensued. So that was another significant ingredient to the end of the war. A few hours later, around lunchtime on the 9th, I believe it was around 11 in the morning, Fat Man was deployed against the city of Nagasaki. Fat Man was basically identical to the Trinity device, again producing 21 kiloton yield. Now you'll notice that the yield is significantly greater than Little Boy, but fewer people were killed in the attack. Why? The difference is that Little Boy exploded over the city center of Hiroshima. The Fat Man exploded on the outskirts of Nagasaki. The bombing, the target was the Mitsubishi Heavy Armaments Complex, a series of factories that, among other things, produced the torpedoes used in the attack on Pearl Harbor. The bomb went off directly over the factory, destroyed it, but fewer people were killed, again, because the bomb exploded on the outskirts of town versus exploding right over the middle. The war continued for a few days. But finally, Japan surrendered on August 14th. Fighting stopped that day. The emperor addressed the nation. His speech is easy to find. I would encourage you to take a look at it. But, there's a lot of debate. I go back to Alex Wellerstein. Alex, very recently on his blog, wrote a great post called "What I Wish Every Journalist Knew About the End of World War II," or the atomic bombings, or something like that. If you want to know how I feel, go read Alex's blog post, because he does a really good job going through this history. From my vantage point, you see a lot of debate through the decades. This ended the war. That ended the war. For me, I think of it, my analogy, my own spin is, it's like baking a cupcake. You cannot bake a cupcake with one ingredient. You need to put several things together to produce a nice outcome in the case of a cupcake. That's what happened with World War II. The atomic bombs in and of themselves did not end the war. But I would argue that they played a significant part in ending the war. I would say maybe they were the flour or the sugar in our cupcake, but there were other things, many other things as well. So again, that's my subjective approach. You may have a different one. Let's continue on because we're just about done now. We'll talk about what Trinity means very quickly. I think that's what we've got coming up next. The legacy of Trinity is, in my opinion, pretty clearly multifaceted. You know, from the standpoint of the war, I don't think Japan ever had a chance to win World War II from the moment that they attacked Pearl Harbor, but Trinity marked the, Japan was not only going to lose the war, but they were going to lose it quickly now. So I think that it is an important part of the final chapter of World War II. Trinity also opened up a new era in human history. It opened up the atomic age, and there are not too many scientific experiments, single scientific experiments that you can point to and say, yeah, that created a new era in human history. And I think that's one of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons why Trinity is a candidate for greatest scientific experiment of all time. But again, let's go back to the other side of that. This is also the advent of a new destructive weapon, the likes of which humanity has never seen. Mutual assured destruction and things of that nature did not exist in the 40s. Nuclear deterrence really did not exist in the 1940s. Remember, we used this weapon in combat. We weren't trying to deter the Japanese. It was a combat weapon. There were not thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons that existed at that point in time, but there would be. And they would get more and more powerful as time went on. And they would collectively represent a new threat that mankind had never seen. But at the same time, it seems thus far, we hope, that these have played a part in keeping the peace between the great powers of the world. We'll see what happens. And there were other factors as well. But I do think that nuclear weapons had helped keep that tenuous peace. We talked about it being the greatest scientific experiment ever, possibly. And also, I mentioned that this helped usher in the age of super science. What do I mean by super science? Well, to me, what that term means is when you have the United States government, in this case, academia, and private industry coming together to change the world. There have been partnerships between those entities before. They're not hard to find, but not on this scale. Not where you had hundreds of thousands of people working toward a single purpose all at the same time together. And I think that Trinity was, up to that point in history, unique in that regard in terms of scale. And I think that it served as a template for other massive programs that would follow, such as the Apollo program. And another one, the Human Genome Project, which Los Alamos is closely connected with, our history there as well. But anyway, I think that that is what I think about when I think of Trinity, is a whole new world filled with promise and great peril as well. Let's go on and see, we just have a couple more closing slides here. I got to visit the Trinity site on the 70th anniversary, and I visited there with Charlie McMillan. Many of you will remember that Charlie, who you see photographed there, was our director for several years. And that was a fun day for me, getting to travel to Trinity and back, just one-on-one with a laboratory director. We had a lot of great conversations, and I'm the one who took that picture there of Charlie standing where Oppenheimer and Groves did. Charlie had never visited Trinity site, and with the 70th anniversary coming up, he wanted to. He wanted to be at the place where history in a moment changed forever, especially considering that he was Oppenheimer's, one of Oppenheimer's successors. And so that's what it looks like today. It's an interesting, that's right, Tommy. And we met up with some of our colleagues from the laboratories there as well that day. But this is kind of what it still looks like today. It's an interesting site. Most of the things associated with the test are long gone. They were destroyed. They were vaporized. The McDonald Ranch House, which you see there, that's where the plutonium was assembled before it was sent to ground zero. It's still standing and in nice condition, thanks to our friends down at Kirtland, or not at Kirtland in this case at least, but at White Sands Missile Range, what is today. Back then it was the Alamogordo bombing range. Jumbo is still there. That is the cylinder that you see in the middle. As we talked about before, it was, they tried to blow it up and succeeded to some degree, but Jumbo is still there. But it's a very interesting site to visit. And for those of you who have not visited there before, let me encourage you to try and make that trip if you get the chance. And hopefully this talk will help to provide some context and several different perspectives on what happened and what it meant. And I think that is it. I think that we have another slide or two with credits, which I'd like to leave up for a moment. I'm going to stick around for some Q&A. Here, let's see and make sure. I think we've maybe got two. One is additional things to read. I've mentioned several of those things, and you can request the slides. And let's go on to the next slide, because I had a lot of people who helped me put this together. And I want to thank them. There's people who I've forgotten, and I'm grateful that they helped me with this as well. But I hope that you enjoyed the talk. I hope that it answered some of your questions. And I hope that it will, you'll have some things to reflect on a week from today when we get to the anniversary. That's it. Let's do some Q&A, and I'll do my best. Jonathan, thanks for your patience and your help, by the way.
Great. All right. So can you see the questions, or do you want to start with so there's a first question that popped up from Andrew. And again, everybody, thanks for sticking around. If you have to take off at this point, we totally understand. Alan, if you'll stick around for just a second and answer.
Yes.
And then, yeah. So if you have to take off, again, thanks for joining us. Check out the slate of programs that's going on for ScienceFest 2020, and check out some of those links that I showed you. We have some fun stuff happening around the lab and around Los Alamos and for the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. So, let's see. Okay, so just first up, Alan, were there any fears of Imperial Japan acquiring a nuclear weapon compared to Nazi Germany?
I would say that there were not significant fears that I'm aware of about Japan acquiring a nuclear weapon. As we already talked about, there was significant concern with Germany, and for pretty obvious reasons. Fission was first produced in Germany. Hitler, of course, would have great motive to be the first and only person to have one of these weapons. And of course, Germany had been a center of many different fields of science, not just physics, but also chemistry, metallurgy, and on and on and on. With Japan, Japan also had a nuclear weapons program. And I should mention, Germany had a nuclear weapons program, so did Imperial Japan. Neither of them made significant progress relative to the Manhattan Project. But we didn't know that at the time. We were very concerned with the Germans. But again, going back to the question, Jonathan, that was asked, there was not as much concern with the Japanese. Now, one tidbit that I'll throw in that pertains to the end of the war, we did know that Japan had very good scientists there. Germany did, of course, but so did Japan. And so Louis Alvarez was another one of our Nobel laureates. At Nagasaki, we actually dropped two things in the area of Nagasaki. One was Fat Man, but the other thing was a letter that was written by Louis Alvarez with input from two of our other scientists, Philip Morrison, who we mentioned earlier, and Robert Serber. And he said, you know, look, we've tested one of these bombs. We've dropped one on Hiroshima. We've dropped another one this morning, and this rain of ruin will increase manyfold if you don't quit now. They were concerned that the Japanese would think, well, you know, look, it may have taken them a year. It may have taken them 5 years to produce enough material for this bomb. Maybe we can hold out for a while. Maybe we can keep fighting for better terms, for instance. And as I mentioned, there were many reasons why the Japanese continued fighting on. I don't know if that was a major concern in Japan or not, because we don't have a lot of records from them because they destroyed them all, but it was very much a concern of the Manhattan Project and specifically our scientists here. We wanted to show them that it wasn't some one-off gimmick, that this was something that we could rapidly reproduce. They might as well give up now.
And I feel like we always hear that we don't get enough material for a couple of weapons. How long would it have taken us to then develop more?
Well, we had another pit that did not leave the United States. And so I'm guessing that they could have easily had one in combat within the next 10 days. And I believe that the production rates by the end of 1945, we probably could have put a nuclear weapon into combat on a weekly basis by the end of the year. And so production was only going up and up and up at that point in time. And I've seen some evidence to suggest that they were thinking about using nuclear weapons in a tactical manner to support an invasion had it proven necessary. And I should say, you know, an invasion of Japan was not imminent. They were thinking about it, there were plans for it, but it's not like, you know, the next week they were going to invade Japan. They were really, really hoping to avert that. And fortunately, World War II ended sooner rather than later.
So another question that we have is about the test itself. Did the test need to be during darkness or data collection or for data collection or other technical reasons? Seems like daytime would not be noticed near as much.
Oh, right. Well, I think that they in daylight, they're pretty bright, and there were enough people nearby, like at the Nevada test site. And I'll come back to Trinity in just a moment. But most of the tests done in Nevada were done at daybreak. They wanted to do them early, but they wanted there to be enough light to get good pictures and different things like that. And not just of the fireball. I mean, once the fireball goes out, it kind of gets dark and you can't take pictures very effectively. So most of the start times were just as the sun was coming up pretty early in the morning, of course, with lots of exceptions mixed in there as well. With Trinity, they were hoping for darkness. Basically that coincided with people being in bed, is what they were hoping for. So that was the main reason. But yeah, I mean, 5:30 in the morning from if you were doing this purely for experimental purposes, 5:30 is a better time than 4. But there was the security concern as well.
All right. Go ahead. Is there evidence that other world powers had intelligence on the project's progress during the time?
Yes. And I think, actually, let me take that back. I couldn't hear everything there, but I heard evidence of, I wasn't sure if it was world powers or axis powers, because the answer is different.
It says world powers.
World powers, okay, very good. So regarding axis powers, I'm not aware of any documentation that, Germany or Japan were scared that we were going to make a bomb. However, there was one country that very much knew that we were trying to build an atomic bomb, and that would be the Soviet Union. And so I do have a talk on espionage at Los Alamos during the war. Some of you unfortunate souls have probably seen that one too. But the Soviet Union knew about this technology. The Soviet Union had very, very talented scientists. But keep in mind, those fatality numbers that I gave earlier, as many as 27 million people died in the Soviet Union, and the European portion of their country lay in ruin at the end of the war. And, I don't know how many scientists that we have here who would prefer to work in a country like the Soviet Union versus a country like the United States. It's not really the best situation to do science in, especially when your boss is named Lavrenti Beria. Now, that brings it back to the question. Look, if you've not heard of Lavrenti Beria before, he was in charge of the Soviet secret police. And so it was known as the NKVD back then, later the KGB, which we've all heard of. So Beria is in charge of the secret police and the Soviet atomic bomb project. Beria was one of history's nastiest dudes. Look him up in the morning, because if you look up Beria stuff tonight, you'll have nightmares. And I kid you not, this guy was a really awful, terrible individual. He's gathering information that's being sent back from the Soviet Union by the spies of the United States and filtering it to the scientists who were trying to build an atomic bomb. And so they did have a lot of information. There were 4 known spies at Los Alamos during the war. The most devastating, in my opinion, by far, was Klaus Fuchs, who was a section leader in the theoretical division. He was a senior theoretical scientist, physicist. Ted Hall, David Greenglass, and a more recent discovery named Oscar Sabor as well. Fuchs in particular provided a lot of information to the Soviet Union, and they were able to duplicate Fat Man basically as a result of that. But that all started back during World War II. So I hope that helps answer the question. One other power I'll mention really quickly is the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom was our ally, not only in fighting, but also in developing atomic weapons. And that's really an understatement, because it was the Brits. Remember, it took 3 years for the Manhattan Project to get going after the Einstein letter. The Brits were the ones who really helped us to recognize that nuclear weapons were going to be a transformative technology, and they were at hand. And so not only were there, in this case, was there another power that knew, there was one that was way ahead of us early on in the war, again, the United Kingdom.
So here's a discussion here in Los Alamos. Any guesses as to how many people watched Trinity from Sandia Peak and from Sawyer Hill?
Okay. So the short answer is no. I don't, and I should, but I will share a couple of things that might be useful in trying to find out that number. And if you find out that number, let me know, and I will add it to the presentation. One is earlier when we had quotes from people who witnessed Trinity, one of those quotes was from Marge Bradner. Marge wrote like a page long, and I can send this to you if you'd like to see it. I've not looked at the whole document in a while, but Marge was one of the unofficial witnesses for the Trinity test. And I forget, I don't think that she watched from up here. I think that she was further closer to Santa Fe or something like that. But anyway, I don't know about numbers, but at least in terms of what it was like to be one of the unofficial observers, again, if you will, Marge's summary of that is very good. And of course, her and her husband, Hugh, they were both here during the war. Hugh Bradner shot a bunch of home movies from Los Alamos during the war, and these should not exist, but Oppenheimer let him make films. And I've got I think about 50 minutes of that footage on my YouTube site. So if you'd like to see that. And I think that Hugh Bradner also invented the wetsuit of all things, you know, these guys. But anyway, that's one thing. What was the other? I only know one living witness to the Trinity test. I don't know any official witnesses who were down at the site, but I've met one unofficial witness, and his name is John Mars. I think he's worth $30 or $40 billion. If you've heard the name before, that's Mars, as in the M&M Mars plant. I met John Mars once, and he told me that as a young boy, he would have been, I think, about 10 at the time. He and his father were on a camping trip in the mountains, and this bomb, there's this explosion. It spooked the horses. It woke them up, and they saw a little bit of the aftermath of Trinity. And so again, I met John just that one day. But he's the only one that I know of now. Unfortunately, we just have almost nobody left who actually saw the test happen. But yeah, that's my Trinity survivor story these days. And again, I can send you Marge Bradner's remarks if you'd like to see it, or you can look them up on your own. But I would like to know that number if somebody figures it out.
Did Oppenheimer have a Z number? And if so, what was the Z number?
I know that one. Okay, well, I kind of know that one. Yes, Oppenheimer did have a Z number. And for those of you who are listening in and you don't work at the laboratory, Z numbers are kind of how we're tracked. You know, it's kind of like a social security number type thing, except it only applies to the laboratory. So Oppenheimer does have one, but these were not created until after the war. And so a lot of people think Oppenheimer, well, he has Z number 1. And he doesn't. I think it's either 1,000 something or 10,000 something. I think that he was assigned that number when he came back as an official visitor in around 1960, 1961. That would coincide with a number about that high. But I think it may be a 10,000 number there. But Z numbers were not created until, I think, April of 1946.
Right. So with the Trinity, inside Jumbo modified the measured yield.
Could you say that again?
With the detonation of Trinity, inside of Jumbo modified the measured yield.
I don't know how they would have measured it. I think that they had other ways of measuring it besides measuring the fireball pictures. I mentioned that one because I'm familiar with that one, because we are still interested in those measurements today. And it is a very good way of calculating yield, but there are other ways as well, including radiochemistry or something like that. So my guess is maybe they would have primarily relied on radiochemical analysis or something like that to get a good yield. Again, just a guess, but there would have been other ways. If they would have been more effective, I don't know. There's probably some folks listening who really have a strong opinion on that.
So in your statement earlier, it mentioned mattresses when they were hoisting the gadget. Why
Yes.
the mattresses?
I'm not 100% sure, but I think to cushion the blow if it fell. Now, obviously, if it's like 89 feet up there and something breaks, it's not going to help. But I think I'm not sure if it was for psychological purposes or if it's like when they just started to get it up a little bit, if there was, because that's probably when a break would occur. It probably occurred pretty quickly, but that's just a guess. But there were mattresses, and we have that on film. If you're sitting there thinking, what a bunch of crap, then we do have that on film.
Right. What radioactive material was added to the TNT test?
I forget specifically what it was, but I think it came out of, so remember at Hanford, they're making plutonium. And I think that it was a byproduct that came out of the reactors at Hanford. And I think that this is something that's relatively easily found in the open literature. So I would encourage people, I forgot, among my disclaimers, and all the people that left, I'm sorry that I didn't get to say this to them, but disclaimer number one is never trust a historian. Put me to the test, look it up, let me know what I got wrong or what was incomplete or what was misleading. And this is one of those things. Look it up, and I think that you can find it, but I'm fairly confident it was a byproduct that came out of the reactors at Hanford.
Was there concern that the atmosphere would catch on fire from Trinity?
Well, I'm going to give a technical answer to that. No. Now, a lot of people are going to be, now, wait a minute, I heard you used the word Trinity there. By the time Trinity came, by the time it was Trinity and they were confident that that would not happen. Now, early on, there was, very early on, and I think this goes all the way back to 1942, even before Los Alamos came into existence, this question was raised. And I know Mark Chadwick's here with us tonight because I saw his comment there, and I think that he and others may be able to correct me. I think that question may have been first raised by Edward Teller, and I believe that Hans Bethe did the calculations on it that revealed that no, this was not going to be a problem. So it was a concern, it was raised, it was explored, and it was put to rest, I believe, long before Trinity came about. So again, correct me if I've got that wrong.
Somebody just said it closed the loop on Truman and Potsdam.
Oh, right. Very good. So Truman knew very quickly that the United States had acquired nuclear weapons at that point in time. And he was pretty jovial about it, is my understanding. He was pretty excited. And, again, if you're the president and you're sending millions of Americans into harm's way, and all of a sudden you have a weapon available to you that could change things, you might be excited about it too. And so I think that he was pretty excited about it. He did not tell Stalin the specifics. Of course, Churchill knew all of this. In fact, our agreement with the Brits was that we had to agree before putting it into combat. Now, I don't know, my friend Richard Moore, my counterpart in the UK, has been exploring this and doing some very interesting research on it. I don't know if it was ever, I don't think there was any ever formal approval of that. But anyway, we had to agree with the Brits to put it into use according to our formal agreement. Whether it did, whatever. But Churchill was very glad about this too, is my understanding. But they didn't tell Stalin. What Truman told Stalin was basically that, hey, we've got a cool new thing that we're, didn't talk about an atomic bomb. And I forgot the exact verbiage. This is something else that's readily available in the open literature. But anyway, I think Stalin's reply was, well, I hope you put it to good use against the Japanese, or something like that. Now, that's what's going on during the conference. When the conference is over, and of course, this too, some of you may be seeing stories about Potsdam cropping up next week in addition to Trinity. For a lot of people, Potsdam is the bigger story than Trinity. For us in Los Alamos, Trinity is our big 75th. But anyway, when the conference was over, knowing that he had nuclear weapons available and was going to soon have an assembly line of them, Truman ordered, he threatened the Japanese. He said, you will surrender unconditionally or you will face prompt and utter destruction. Did not, again, specifically mention nuclear weapons or anything like that. And I think the reason why is they wanted to maximize the amount of shock of this entirely new weapon going into combat. No warning, we're not going to give you any time to think about it. Just all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you're going to be hit with the most destructive weapon ever, and you're going to have to figure it out on your own. That was, I think, again, it was very much a weapon of psychology. And so the Japanese officially responded by officially ignoring it. And there are articles on this. I'll mispronounce it, but it's called Makasatsu or something like that. And it is basically an official ignoring somebody. And that was their response after Potsdam. And so there was a warning, but it was not specifically for nuclear weapons.
So kind of following along with that, another question was, to what extent was the US looking forward to the threat of the Soviet Union when it decided to bomb Japan? Was it sending a message at all, or ending the war? Was ending the war kind of a dominant consideration?
So this is a great question, and this is something that's been debated among historians and political scientists for decades and decades. And I would say that this is something that is largely subjective because there's not a whole lot of gotcha documents. You know, you're basically looking at meeting minutes and letters and personal recollections and things like that. And if you extract bits from those, you can make a pretty compelling case that, that we were trying to intimidate the Soviet Union. Now, my opinion is the reason that we used nuclear weapons in combat, we the United States, was because we wanted the war to end. That's why I believe that they were used. Now, what are the unintended or intended other consequences of that? I think one of them was intimidating the Soviet Union. You know, policymakers, you know, the Secretary of War, Stemson, and the Secretary of State, Burns, these were smart folks. You know, they knew what Joseph Stalin was. And what the Soviet Union was in World War II was nothing more than an ally of convenience to try and defeat Germany. That's it. And maybe to help end the war against Japan as well. And remember, we invited the Soviets into the war in the Pacific. They accepted our request. Now, a couple things did change at the end of the war, but we invited them in, and Stalin said, absolutely. But going back to this debate, to me, when I look at the scant documentation, and usually what you see are just little bits and pieces of it pulled out to prove a point. That's why you should never trust a historian, including this one, right? Go back and read the documentation. What becomes clear to me is that, you know, we were trying to end the war as quickly as possible using all means at our disposal. Blockade, conventional bombing, atomic bombs, Soviet entry. What I see is that the strategy was we are going to throw everything in the kitchen sink at the Japanese to try and end the war. Now, these policymakers in Washington who were very smart, they recognized that intimidating Stalin might be a serendipitous benefit to putting these in combat in Japan. It's clear to me, at least, and again, subjective, but it's pretty clear to me that that's not why we used the atomic bombs. That was a serendipitous benefit. And I will add to that, a lot of people make it, who do believe that that was the main reason why we used atomic bombs, make it sound like intimidating Stalin's a bad thing. I don't. I can think of few things more noble than intimidating somebody like Joseph Stalin. But that's not, I don't think, why they did it. It was just something that they thought, well, hey, this is a nice bonus. And again, that's me. Go and see what other historians have said. You might think that I don't know what I'm talking about and I got it totally wrong. Go and look around. Let me encourage you to explore other perspectives on that. But the more I look at it, the more my point of view kind of crystallizes. And I can't hear you right now, Jonathan.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So we had one comment about the suggested reading slide, so I'm going to put that back up while I ask a couple more questions. If you can bear with us for just a little while longer. What was the expected yield of the Trinity test? Do they have any idea?
They ranged greatly. To my knowledge, there was no official predicted yield of the test. There was and I think that Richard Rhodes's book, do we have him? Yeah, there he is. He's got to be on every reading list about this type of stuff, right? But anyway, I think that there was basically a betting pool. People would pick different yields, and I think that there was a pot that you could win if you were the closest, pot of money that you could win if you were the closest in guesses. And those yields ranged from, as I recall, 0, right? Going back to Oppenheimer, that's where his money was. I think all the way up to 40 kilotons, I think was the highest. And that may have been an Edward Teller guess, which would make sense for those of us who know Edward, right? But I think most of the guesses were below or well below 20 kilotons. And so I do think that, assuming that 40 is correct, I think that that was really an outlier. But again, go check it out and let me know what I've got wrong.
So maybe just a couple more questions. Was the family that was impacted by the Trinity test, was it closer than the Manhattan Project scientists? You mentioned
I think so. I think so. And and again, looking at our suggested reading here, I clearly remember Frank Zaz talking about that family. And one other thing that I'll mention is I knew Frank. He was a great person and a wonderful professor. He wrote on a lot of different topics, and I would encourage you to explore his work. Him, being a New Mexican historian, looking at a lot of things pertaining to our history. That's a very good book, but it's also getting close to 40 years old. And so there are new documents that have become available, new perspectives have been shared and heard. And so that book is, just purely by the passage of time, getting a little bit dated as well. And that's why I look forward to James Konetka's, my friend Jim Konetka's book coming out on Trinity, hopefully late this year, but more likely sometime next year. Unfortunately, we didn't make the anniversary on that. But, I know that Jim, he did Freedom of Information Act requests. He had a clearance at the laboratory as a visiting scientist many years ago, and so he's got a really good perspective to write on these things. But for now, I'm thinking that Frank Zaz's book is probably the one to go to trace what happened to that family after Trinity. And I'll defer to Frank on that because he's done the research.
All right. And so I'll ask one more question. Were there any women present at the Trinity test?
Not as official observers. And, I know that if Marie's still there, she'll get mad at me if I don't share this story. There was one woman who was a group leader at Los Alamos during World War II, and her name was Charlotte Serber. And Charlotte ran the technical collection of documents. We had books and all kinds of articles. And of course, we had to organize all the reports that were being produced during the war. And Charlotte did a great job. In fact, I think after the war was over, Oppenheimer said, Charlotte, you did a great job. You're the only group that nobody complained about. And that was the big compliment. And here's Marie, good. But Marie shared this story with me, and I've heard it in other places as well, because I've looked into this. But apparently Charlotte was the only group leader at the laboratory who was not present at Trinity. And so I'm not aware of any official witnesses who were women. We've mentioned a couple of names, though. I mentioned Charlotte. I don't think I'm not sure if she saw the test from somewhere else or not. I kind of think she may have. But I mentioned Marge Bradner as well. I should mention, just in closing on that question, this is a history that we're very interested in now. Women comprised about 11% of the workforce during the Manhattan Project, and they're often overlooked. And they provided a wide variety of important duties to the laboratory. These ranged from being secretaries, to doing mathematical calculations, to being technical staff members, to doing all kinds of other things that were absolutely essential to the work. I mean, if we took an 11% hit on the technical staff of the wartime laboratory, things may have been very different. And so we certainly want to acknowledge that. And I'm very glad that we had that question come up. And I see Ellen's name. Yes, thank you, Marie. I don't know the answer to your question there about women at Trinity. I don't know if Ellen's tuned in tonight or not, but Ellen McGee wrote Dr. McGee, my friend, she wrote her master's thesis on the women of Project Y. And so if there are people who are interested in women's history from that point in time, it's fascinating, it's important, and Ellen's literally written the book on it.
Well, Alan, I really appreciate you coming out tonight. Do you mind if I throw your email back in the chat just in case people have questions?
Please do.
I'll include mine as well, just in case you need to get with us and ask us any questions about this. I really appreciate you coming out and giving this talk. This is great for the 75th. And yeah, thanks for joining us. Thank you all for tuning in and sticking around and asking good questions and being involved in the chat. This was a lot of fun.
Great audience, and I appreciate the invitation. And with Trinity coming up, we're busy, and so you may not get an immediate response to your email, but I do respond to every email, unless I just don't like you. But I look forward to writing back, and thank you all for sticking around and attending the talk.
Yeah. So thanks again, everybody. Thanks again, Alan. Also, you can check out the Manhattan Project National Historical Parks social media pages. Check out Twitter, Instagram, Facebook for everything that we have going on. There's lots of stuff coming out. Keep apprised of the Bradbury Science Museum website as well. You'll see all kinds of material coming out. So we thank you for your participation. Thanks for attending Los Alamos Science Fest, and thanks for watching our talk.
right. Jonathan, hey, thank you very much.
Yeah, this is great.
I had a blast. No pun intended. Have a good one, all right?
Good night. Yeah.